The glossy black Mercedes crawled through unfamiliar streets as James Caldwell checked his phone's GPS for the third time. His driver had called in sick, and now he was lost in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods. Row houses with boarded windows lined the crumbling sidewalks, their facades decorated with graffiti. Street lights flickered uncertainly in the growing dusk. James loosened his silk tie, uncomfortable in the heat. He should have been at the charity gala 20 minutes ago. As chairman of Caldwell Industries, his absence would be noticed. He was about to make a U-turn when movement caught his eye. A teenage boy, maybe 15 or 16, stood on the corner displaying small trinkets on a weathered cardboard box. The boy's clothes were clean but worn, jeans with patched knees, a faded t-shirt that hung loose on his thin frame. Despite his circumstances, he maintained a dignified posture, calling out to passing cars with unwavering determination. James pulled over, telling himself he just needed directions. As he approached, the boy's sales pitch died on his lips. His dark eyes watched James warily, taking in the expensive suit and leather briefcase. Looking for something specific, the boy asked, his voice carrying a hint of defensiveness. "Actually, I'm lost," James admitted. "I'm trying to get to the Grand Hotel downtown." "You're way off course." The boy gestured at his merchandise, handmade bracelets, carved wooden figures, simple paintings on small canvases. "But since you're here, want to buy something? Everything's original work." James examined a bracelet, genuinely impressed by the intricate beadwork. "You made these?" "Yeah. Name's Malik." He straightened slightly. "Got to make money somehow, right?" Something in the boy's tone, a familiar determination, made James pause. "I'm James. How long have you been selling these?" "Couple years now. Since Mom got sick." Malik's expression flickered. "Sarah always said art would feed my soul, but I figured out how to make it feed my stomach too." James nearly dropped the bracelet. Sarah. It couldn't be the same Sarah, but his mind raced back 15 years to dark curls and a brilliant smile, to passionate discussions about art and social justice, to the pregnancy test he'd never known about because he'd already left for his father's company in another state. "Sarah," he managed. "Your mother's name is Sarah?" Malik's eyes narrowed. "Yeah. Sarah Thompson." "Why?" James felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Sarah Thompson. The same Sarah. Which meant. "Just wondering if I knew her," he said weakly. "About your age, when was?" "I'm 15, Malik answered, suspicion creeping into his voice. "Look, you want directions or not? I've got other customers to worry about." James pulled out his wallet with trembling fingers, overpaid for the bracelet, and accepted Malik's terse directions. Back in his car, he gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. 15 years. The timing matched perfectly. Sarah Thompson's son. Their son. The possibility thundered in his head as he drove away, but he found himself circling the block, watching Malik in his rearview mirror. The boy's determined stance, the artistic talent, even the shape of his jaw, how had he not seen it immediately? James drove to his hotel in a daze, the charity gala forgotten. He called his assistant, canceling all appointments for the next day. Sleep eluded him as memories of Sarah flooded back, their whirlwind romance, his father's ultimatum about the company, his cowardly departure. He'd tried to find her years later, but she'd moved away. Now here was Malik, selling handmade art on a street corner, probably unaware he was the heir to one of the country's largest fortunes. The weight of 15 years of absence pressed down on James's chest. He knew he should drive away, protect both of them from the complications of truth. Instead, he found himself planning his return to that street corner tomorrow, rehearsing questions that might unravel their shared past without revealing too much too soon. But as dawn approached, one thought kept repeating: how could he possibly bridge the chasm of 15 years? What right did he have to disrupt Malik's life now? The bracelet sat on his nightstand, its intricate patterns a testament to the son he'd never known he had, a son who'd inherited his mother's creativity and learned survival skills his father had never needed to know. The next afternoon found James parked across from Malik's usual corner, gathering courage. The boy was already there, arranging his merchandise with methodical care. James noticed details he'd missed yesterday: the careful way Malik protected his art from the sun, his polite interactions with passers-by, the watchful glances at approaching strangers. James stepped out of his car, this time dressed in casual clothes. Malik spotted him immediately. Back again. Malik's tone mixed wariness with curiosity. The hotel directions weren't clear enough. Actually, I wanted to see more of your work, James said, keeping his voice steady. The craftsmanship on that bracelet is remarkable. Malik's guard lowered slightly. Been practicing since I was 10. Mom taught me the basics before. He trailed off, then straightened. Anyway, got some new pieces today. As Malik showed his artwork, James asked careful questions. Each answer revealed another piece of the life he'd missed: Malik's childhood in various shelters, his mother's struggle with illness, his determination to stay in school despite working the streets. "Where do you sleep?" James asked, trying to mask his growing horror. "Around." Malik's answer came sharp and defensive. "Look, if you're with social services dash." "I'm not," James interrupted. "I'm just..." "What?" "A guilty father. A concerned stranger. I want to help. Don't need help from some rich guy looking to feel better about himself." Malik started packing his things. "Marcus. Tony. Come check out this situation." Two teenage boys materialized from a nearby alley. They flanked Malik, arms crossed, expressions hostile. The taller one, Marcus, spoke first. "This dude bothering you, Mal?" "Says he wants to help," Malik replied, skepticism clear in his voice. Tony, shorter but muscular, stepped forward. "Yeah. Like those church people who want to save our souls. Or those program directors who want to lock us up in group homes." James raised his hands. "Nothing like that. I just want to talk, maybe buy you all some food." "We look hungry to you," Marcus demanded. "Like we need your handouts." Other street kids were gathering now, drawn by the confrontation. James saw the fear beneath their anger, the instinctive distrust of adults who'd probably failed them repeatedly. "You don't need anything from me," James acknowledged. "But Malik's got talent. I'd like to support his art." "My art ain't for sale to people like you anymore," Malik declared. "This is how we survive. It's not your charity case." James felt the situation slipping away. These kids had built their own family, their own support system. His presence threatened that delicate balance. "I understand," he said quietly. "But I'll be around if you change your mind." As he walked back to his car, he heard the group's heated discussion. "He's trouble, Mal. Probably some pervert. Or cops. Just stay away from him." Malik's voice rose above the others. "I can handle myself." James sat in his car, watching the group disperse. Malik returned to his corner, but his relaxed demeanor had vanished. The other kids maintained a protective orbit around him, shooting suspicious glances at James's car. The gulf between their worlds yawned wider than ever. James had hoped money could bridge it. Isn't that what money was for? But these kids had survived by distrusting exactly that kind of offer. He thought of his own teenage years, cushioned by wealth and privilege. How could he possibly connect with a son who'd grown up on the streets? What could he offer besides money, which Malik clearly despised? His phone buzzed, another charity gala invitation. James stared at the glittering event details, then at Malik's corner. The contrast made him sick. Somewhere in this city, Sarah Thompson had raised their son alone, teaching him art and resilience while James attended cocktail parties. The hostility of Malik's friends was deserved. But James couldn't walk away again. He needed a different approach, one that wouldn't threaten the fragile community these kids had built, but might eventually allow him to become part of his son's life. As darkness fell, he watched Malik pack up his unsold art with the same careful attention he'd shown that morning. The other kids drifted back, forming a protective circle as they moved deeper into their territory. James started his car but didn't drive away until they disappeared from view, taking with them all his hopes for an easy reconciliation. The incident erupted without warning on a humid afternoon. James had maintained his distance for several days, observing from his car as Malik worked his corner. He'd noticed the increasing police presence in the area, the nervous energy among the street kids, but wasn't prepared for what happened next. Two patrol cars pulled up alongside Malik's makeshift stand. James watched as officers approached, their hands resting casually on their belts. Malik remained still, his posture careful, controlled. "ID check," one officer announced loudly. "Everyone against the wall." Marcus and Tony emerged from their usual spots, along with 3 other teens. They moved slowly, hands visible, but tension crackled in the air. James stepped out of his car, drawn by instinct toward his son. "These kids aren't doing anything wrong," James called out, approaching the scene. The lead officer turned. "Sir, please return to your vehicle. This is a routine check." "They're just selling artwork," James persisted, moving closer. Other residents began emerging from nearby buildings, drawn by the commotion. "Mind your business, Suit," a voice called from the growing crowd. "We don't need your kind making things worse." Malik shot James a warning look, but it was too late. One of the younger teens, scared and cornered, tried to bolt. An officer grabbed him, and chaos erupted. Marcus moved to help his friend, Tony shouted, and suddenly bodies were colliding. James reached for Malik, intending to pull him to safety, but a resident blocked his path. "Back off." The man's face twisted with anger. "You bring your fancy car around here, watching our kids like some predator, now this. Get out." Others joined in. "Yeah, go back to your mansion. Leave our children alone. Privileged bastard." The police were losing control of the situation. More residents poured onto the street, their fury directed as much at James as at the officers. Malik had disappeared in the chaos, along with most of his friends. "Sir, leave the area now," an officer ordered James, who stood frozen in the middle of the hostility. The crowd's anger felt like a physical force, pushing him back toward his car. "I'm trying to help," he protested weakly. "We don't want your help," someone screamed. "We take care of our own." James retreated to his vehicle as the situation deteriorated further. Through his windshield, he watched the police call for backup, the crowd grow larger, the afternoon dissolve into a mess of shouting and accusations. He'd made everything worse. Hours later, after the streets had cleared and the police had gone, James found himself parked outside a coffee shop several blocks away. The local news played on his phone, coverage of the disturbance in the neighborhood, reporters speculating about gang activity and drug sales. Nothing about the artwork, the kids trying to survive, the community protecting its own. His phone buzzed with a message from his office about a television segment on urban homelessness scheduled for that evening. James almost ignored it, but something made him tune in. The report was predictably superficial: statistics about rising homeless populations, interviews with policy experts, calls for reform. Then came footage from earlier that day. The camera had caught him, the rich outsider, trying to intervene. Comments flooded the news station's social media. Who was this man? What was his real agenda? Some recognized him as James Caldwell, leading to speculation about his company's role in urban development and displacement. James turned off the TV, sick with responsibility. His presence had escalated a routine harassment into a neighborhood incident, then into citywide news. He'd wanted to protect Malik but had instead painted a target on the entire community. Worst of all, he hadn't seen Malik since the chaos began. The boys' corner remained empty as darkness fell. Had he found safe shelter? Were his friends with him? The questions tortured James as he sat in his car, unable to leave yet knowing he couldn't stay. A knock on his window made him jump. An elderly woman peered in at him, her face stern but not hostile. "You're that rich man," she stated flatly. "The one causing trouble." James nodded, rolling down his window. "I didn't mean to dash." "Course you didn't. Nobody means to. But good intentions don't mean much around here." She studied him. "That boy you've been watching, he's something to you, isn't he?" James hesitated, then nodded again. "Thought so. Look like him around the eyes." She sighed. "But this ain't the way. You're making him a target, making all of them targets. Sometimes helping means staying away." She walked off before James could respond, leaving him with the weight of her words. The street remained empty, his son somewhere in the darkness beyond his reach. The gap between them felt wider than ever, carved deeper by the day's events and his own clumsy attempts to bridge it. James sat at the head of Caldwell Industries' conference table, surrounded by skeptical board members. The PowerPoint presentation behind him displayed his proposal, Youth Housing Initiative, a new approach to homelessness. Let me get this straight, Richard Morton, his longest-serving board member, leaned forward. You want to divert $30 million from our real estate division to build housing for homeless teenagers? Not just housing, James corrected, keeping his voice steady. A comprehensive support center. Education facilities, job training, mental health services. And how exactly does this benefit our shareholders? Another board member interrupted. We're not a charity, James. James advanced to the next slide, showing projected community impact statistics. Think bigger picture. We invest in these communities now, property values stabilize, crime rates drop. Or we attract more homeless people to the area, our existing properties lose value, and we waste millions on social services that should be the government's responsibility. Morton's voice dripped with disapproval. The meeting deteriorated from there. James watched his carefully prepared presentation fall flat as board members raised objection after objection. Only a few seemed even marginally interested in the social impact data. Later that afternoon, he received an unexpected visitor in his office. Malik stood in the doorway, looking uncomfortable in the corporate environment but determined. Nice setup you got here, Malik said, glancing around the expansive office. Your secretary almost didn't let me up. How did you find me? James asked, surprised. Internet exists, you know. Wasn't hard to figure out who you are. Malik approached the desk. Saw your little presentation on the news. Building houses for street kids. James gestured to a chair, which Malik ignored. It's more than houses. It's a way to make yourself feel better. Malik's voice hardened. Clear your conscience. That's not fair. Fair. Malik laughed sharply. You want to talk about fair? Where were these fancy plans 15 years ago? Where were you when Mom got sick? When we got evicted? James stood, moved to respond, but Malik continued. You think throwing money at us now makes up for anything? Your board members are right, you don't understand the first thing about our lives. Then help me understand, James pleaded. Work with me on this. Make it what you and your friends actually need, not what I think you need. Malik finally sat, exhaustion briefly replacing anger on his face. My friends think I'm crazy for even coming here. They say you're just another rich guy trying to buy good publicity. And what do you think? I think. Malik hesitated. I think you're trying to fix something that can't be fixed with money. But at least you're trying. Before James could respond, his assistant buzzed in. A community meeting was being organized to discuss his proposal, and the opposition was mounting. The meeting, held in a local church basement that evening, was packed. James recognized faces from the street confrontation days earlier. They weren't any happier to see him now. This is just gentrification in disguise, one resident shouted. First comes the youth center, then the luxury apartments. Where were you when our schools were closing? Demanded another. When our clinics shut down. He's trying to buy his way into our community. James stood at the podium, absorbing their anger. He spotted Malik at the back of the room, watching silently. You're right, James finally said, quieting the crowd. I haven't been here. I didn't see your struggles. I can't undo that. He paused, looking directly at Malik. But I'm here now. Not to take over, not to push anyone out. To listen. To learn. To help, if you'll let me. Why should we trust you? Someone called out. You shouldn't, James admitted. Trust has to be earned. That's why I'm asking for your help in designing this project. Your input, your leadership. Your community, your rules. The room erupted in discussion. James stepped away from the podium, letting them debate. He noticed Malik slip out the back door and followed. You actually meant that? Malik asked when James caught up. About letting the community lead. Yes. James leaned against the church wall. I've been going about this all wrong, haven't I? Pretty much. Malik almost smiled. But maybe there's a way to do it right. They stood in silence, watching the sunset paint the neighborhood in softer colors. The church door opened, spilling out heated discussions about community needs, project oversight, accountability measures. "They'll never fully trust you," Malik warned. "I know." James straightened. "But maybe they'll trust you." The implications of that statement hung between them, heavy with unspoken acknowledgments and possibilities. Inside, the community continued debating their future. Outside, father and son took their first tentative step toward understanding each other. The woman's appearance at the community center construction site stopped all activity. Sarah Thompson stood at the chain-link fence, her dark hair streaked with gray, her face lined but still beautiful. Workers paused their tasks, sensing the tension as James and Malik both turned to stare. "Mom." Malik's voice cracked. "What are you doing here?" Sarah's eyes locked onto James, ignoring the question. 15 years, and this is how I find out you're back. By seeing your face plastered all over the local news." James stepped forward, construction plans forgotten in his hands. "Sarah, I dash. Don't." She cut him off, entering the site through the gate. "Malik, get your things. We need to talk." "I'm working," Malik protested, gesturing to the blueprints he'd been reviewing. "We're finalizing the youth center designs dash. With him." Sarah's laugh was bitter. "You have no idea what you're getting into, baby." Workers discreetly moved away, leaving the three of them in an island of tension. James found his voice again. "Sarah, please. Let me explain dash." "Explain what?" She whirled on him. "How you disappeared when I told you I might be pregnant. How you changed your number, moved offices, made it impossible to find you." Malik's head snapped toward James. "You knew about Mom being pregnant?" James struggled for words. "She said she thought she might be. I was young, scared. My father threatened to cut me off if I stayed with someone he considered beneath our family's status." "Beneath your status," Sarah repeated coldly. "So that's what I was. What we were. You don't understand dash. No, you don't understand." Sarah's control finally broke. "You don't understand working 3 jobs while pregnant. You don't understand holding your sick child in emergency rooms because you can't afford a doctor. You don't understand watching your baby go hungry because you had to choose between food and rent." Each word hit James like a physical blow. Malik stood frozen between them, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "I raised him alone," Sarah continued, her voice dropping dangerously. "I taught him art when we couldn't afford toys. I held him through nights in homeless shelters. I watched him grow into an amazing young man without any help from you. And now he's trying to help others like us," Malik interjected quietly. "Is he?" Sarah turned to her son. "Or is he trying to ease his guilty conscience? Buy his way back into our lives?" "That's not fair," James protested. "I'm trying to make things right dash." "Right." Sarah laughed again, the sound harsh in the morning air. "You think building some fancy center erases what you did? What we went through?" Malik stepped between them. "Mom, stop. This isn't just about us anymore. The center will help kids who have nowhere else to go. Like we did." Sarah's voice softened as she looked at her son. "Baby, men like him, they don't change. They throw money at problems and expect everything to be fixed." "Maybe," Malik acknowledged. "But the money's real. The help is real. Doesn't that count for something?" Sarah studied her son's face, then James's. "You look like him," she said finally. "I used to pray you wouldn't, but you do. Same eyes. Same stubborn jaw." She turned back to James. "Did it hurt? Seeing him on that street corner, selling art to survive?" "Yes," James whispered. "Good." Sarah straightened. "It should hurt. That pain you felt. We lived it. Every day for 15 years. The silence that followed felt endless. Construction sounds gradually resumed in the background, life continuing despite their private drama. Finally, Malik spoke. "I'm staying," he said firmly. "The center needs to be built. These kids need help. Like you needed help? Sarah asked softly. Yes. Malik met her gaze. Exactly like that. And if he's willing to provide it now, I'm willing to accept it. Not for him. For them. Sarah looked between them once more, then nodded slowly. I'll be watching, she warned James. Every move. Every decision. One wrong step. I understand, James said quietly. She turned to leave, then paused. Malik, dinner's at 6. Your father can come. If he dares. They watched her walk away, her head held high just as Malik's always was. The construction sound seemed louder now, filling the space where their emotions had roared moments before. Well, Malik said finally, that could have gone worse. James looked at his son, seeing Sarah's strength reflected in his stance. Will you tell me about it someday? Growing up? Maybe. Malik picked up the blueprints they'd dropped. But right now, we have work to do. The protest started small, just Malik and a few others holding signs outside City Hall. James watched from his car as a young woman with close-cropped hair and intense eyes organized the group, directing them with quiet authority. That's Aisha, Malik explained later, when James asked. She's been fighting for homeless youth rights since she aged out of foster care. Aisha became a regular presence at the construction site, challenging every decision, questioning every design choice. At first, James found her persistence frustrating, until he noticed how she made Malik's face light up, how his son stood taller in her presence. The sleeping areas need to be smaller, she insisted during one planning meeting. More private spaces, less dormitory style. Smaller rooms mean fewer beds, James pointed out. Better to help fewer kids well than warehouse many badly, Aisha countered. Malik nodded in agreement, and James saw something shift between them, a shared understanding that went beyond the project. One evening, James arrived at the site to find Malik and Aisha sitting on a pile of construction materials, heads bent close together over a notebook. We're planning a bigger demonstration, Malik explained, not moving away from Aisha. The city's trying to pass new anti-loitering laws that would basically criminalize being homeless. They can't keep pushing us into the shadows, Aisha added, her voice fierce but controlled. We need visibility, not more policing. James studied their body language, the way they unconsciously mirrored each other's movements. How can I help? Both teenagers looked surprised. You want to help? Aisha asked skeptically. Won't that hurt your corporate image? My image can handle it, James replied. What do you need? They spent the next hour planning. James watched his son come alive, suggesting strategies, building on Aisha's ideas. This was a different Malik than the angry boy from the street corner, more focused, more hopeful. The demonstration grew larger than any of them expected. Hundreds gathered, many carrying signs Aisha and Malik had designed. James stood at the back, watching his son address the crowd. We're not asking for handouts, Malik's voice rang clear. We're demanding the right to exist in public spaces. To be seen. To be treated as human beings. Aisha stood beside him, their shoulders touching. When Malik's voice faltered, she stepped forward seamlessly, continuing his thoughts as if they shared one mind. Later, as the crowd dispersed, James saw them slip away together. They walked close, hands almost touching, lost in conversation. He started to follow but stopped himself. Some moments weren't meant for fathers, especially ones who'd just entered their children's lives. The next day, Malik arrived at the construction site with new energy. Aisha thinks we should add a legal aid office to the center, he announced. She knows lawyers who'd volunteer. Good idea, James agreed, noting how his son's face softened at Aisha's name. She's quite something, isn't she? Malik's guard went up immediately. Don't try to use her to connect with me. That's not what I dash. She's the real thing, Malik continued. She actually understands what we've been through. She lived it. Not like me, James finished quietly. Yeah. Malik turned away, but not before James caught the conflict in his expression. She says I'm too forgiving. That I should make you work harder for, whatever this is. Is that what you think? I think. Malik hesitated. I think she's right about most things. But maybe not about this. They worked in silence for a while, reviewing plans that had grown more complex with each of Aisha's suggestions. Finally, Malik spoke again. She lost her parents when she was 6. Foster care until she aged out. No one ever came looking for her. The weight of that statement hung between them. James understood the message, at least he had come looking, eventually. The protest was her idea, Malik continued. She said if I really wanted to honor where I came from, I needed to fight for those still there. Not just help build one center. She's right, James said softly. Yeah. Malik almost smiled. She usually is. That evening, James watched from his office window as Malik and Aisha left the construction site together. They paused under a streetlight, and James saw his son reach for her hand. She took it, their fingers intertwining naturally, comfortably. The scene blurred slightly in James's vision. His son had found something real, something honest, in the midst of all the complexity their reunion had brought. Aisha might question James's motives, might challenge his every decision, but she gave Malik something James couldn't, understanding born of shared experience, strength forged in similar struggles. He turned away from the window, leaving them their privacy. There would be time tomorrow for plans and projects, for navigating the complicated waters of their developing relationship. Tonight was for youth, for hope, for the kind of connection that grew from shared battles and common dreams. The St. Mary's shelter smelled of industrial cleaner and old coffee. James stood in the doorway, watching volunteers serve dinner to a long line of tired faces. He'd visited 6 shelters today, each one teaching him something new about the world his son had grown up in. Mr. Caldwell. A volunteer approached. We weren't expecting someone from your position. I'm here to learn, James replied, noting the skepticism in her expression. May I help serve? For the next hour, James ladled soup into plastic bowls, trying to meet each person's eyes, to see them as individuals rather than statistics. A teenage boy near the end of the line caught his attention, not because he looked like Malik, but because of the sketchbook clutched under his arm. You're Malik's dad, aren't you? The boy asked as James served him. I'm Devin. We used to share that corner sometimes. James paused, soup ladle suspended. You know Malik? Everyone knows Malik, Devin said, settling at a nearby table. He was always sharing his food, teaching other kids how to make stuff they could sell. Even gave me my first set of pencils. James sat across from him, dinner service forgotten. Tell me more. Devin opened his sketchbook, revealing detailed urban landscapes. Malik saw me drawing with a ballpoint pen on newspaper. Came back the next day with real art supplies. Said talent deserves proper tools. That sounds like him, James said softly. Yeah, well. Devin's expression hardened. Where'd he learn that? Not from you, right? The accusation stung, but James didn't defend himself. No. From his mother. And from living on these streets. You know what he did with his first big sale? Devin continued, warming to his story. Split it with 3 other kids who hadn't eaten that day. Wouldn't even take it back when they tried to repay him later. More shelter residents gathered around, adding their own Malik stories. James listened, each anecdote revealing another facet of his son's character, how he'd organized a makeshift art class for younger kids, how he'd stood up to bullies targeting newcomers, how he'd always seemed older than his years. He was like our big brother, a young girl added. Even when he didn't have nothing, he acted like he had everything to share. The cops used to hassle us all the time, another teen contributed. But Malik taught us to stay calm, be respectful, keep our hands visible. Said getting angry just gives them an excuse. James absorbed every word, building a picture of the son he'd never known. A natural leader, protective of others despite his own vulnerability. Sarah had raised him well, teaching him to turn hardship into strength. Later that night, inspired by what he'd learned, James began drafting new additions to the youth center plans. Art supplies. Legal workshops. Peer mentoring programs. Everything his son had provided informally, formalized and funded. His phone buzzed. Malik. Heard you been asking about me at the shelters, his son said without preamble. I needed to understand, James replied. To know who you are, not just who I assume you are. A long pause. And I'm proud of you, James said simply. Not for surviving, though that's remarkable. For how you helped others survive too. Another pause. That's what community is, Malik finally responded. Something you're just learning about. Yes, James acknowledged. I am. Devin called me, Malik continued. Said you really listened. Didn't just throw money around or make promises. I'm trying to do this right. Yeah. Malik's voice softened slightly. Maybe you are. They talked for a while longer, Malik explaining the intricate support networks that existed among street kids, the unwritten rules and unofficial families that formed in society's shadows. James took notes, knowing each detail could help make the center more effective. One more thing, Malik said before hanging up. All those kids at the shelter. They're still there. Still waiting for help. I know, James replied. That's why we need to get this right. Not just the center, everything. Everything. Malik's tone was skeptical. The laws. The system. The way people see kids like you were. Like I am, Malik corrected. Don't think having a rich dad suddenly changes who I am. No, James agreed. It doesn't. And it shouldn't. After they hung up, James stayed at his desk, reviewing his notes from the shelter visits. His son had created a support system from nothing, turned his own pain into protection for others. The center needed to build on that, not replace it. He began working on a new proposal, not just for one building, but for a network of connected services. Legal aid where Malik had offered street-smart advice. Healthcare where he'd shared band-aids and over-the-counter medicines. Art therapy where he'd given away pencils and hope. The magnitude of the task ahead was daunting, but James felt more certain than ever about the path forward. His son had already shown the way. Now it was time to follow his lead. The fundraising event transformed the Grand Hotel's ballroom into an art gallery. Malik's street art hung alongside works from established artists, their raw energy drawing crowds of wealthy potential donors. But the real focus was on the podium, where Malik stood adjusting his tie, a compromise between James's world and his own. You don't have to do this, James said quietly, watching his son's nervous movements. Yes, I do. Malik's fingers dropped from the tie. These people need to understand. Really understand. The crowd settled into their seats, corporate executives, city officials, society figures who'd normally cross the street to avoid kids like Malik had been. James recognized the irony, he'd once been just like them. Malik approached the microphone, his stance shifting from nervous to determined. I was 10 the first time I slept in a doorway, he began, his voice steady. My mom was in the hospital. The shelter was full. I had a backpack with 2 shirts and some colored pencils. The room fell silent. James watched faces change as Malik continued, describing nights of hunger and fear, days of trying to stay invisible while selling enough art to eat. But this isn't about making you feel sorry for me, Malik declared. This is about the kids still out there. The ones you pretend not to see. They're artists, writers, dreamers, fighters. They're surviving despite everything the city throws at them. Imagine what they could become if we actually help them survive. James saw tears in some eyes, discomfort in others. Malik wasn't offering the sanitized version of homelessness they'd expected. He was giving them truth, raw and undeniable. The youth center my father is funding. Malik continued, glancing at James. It's a start. But it's not enough. We need systemic change. We need you, all of you, to see us as human beings, not problems to solve. The speech concluded to heavy applause. As donors crowded around with checkbooks open, James noticed the pride in his son's posture. Malik worked the room with natural charm, but never softened his message. Each donation came with a promise extracted, not just money, but involvement, engagement, real change. Later, as they packed up the artwork, Malik spoke quietly. That wasn't so hard. You were amazing, James replied. You made them listen. Yeah, well. Malik carefully wrapped a painting. Learned that from Mom. She always said if you want change, you have to make people uncomfortable first. She's right. James helped with the wrapping. Speaking of your mother, How are things at home? Malik's hands stilled. Better. She's still angry at you, but... He shrugged. She sees you trying. Says actions matter more than words. Smart woman. Yeah. Malik resumed packing. She's thinking about teaching art classes at the center. Once it's open. The news surprised James. Really? That would be wonderful. Don't get too excited, Malik warned. She's doing it for the kids, not you. I know. James smiled slightly. Like mother, like son. They worked in companionable silence until Malik spoke again. The media's been calling. They want to do a story about us. Long-lost billionaire's son, redemption narrative, all that. We don't have to dash. I want to, Malik interrupted. But not their version. The real story. About privilege and poverty. About how some kids get second chances and others don't get any chances at all. James studied his son's determined expression. It could get messy. Personal. Everything about this is messy and personal. Malik met his father's eyes. But maybe that's the point. Maybe people need to see the mess to understand why it matters. Your mother won't like the publicity. Already talked to her. Malik grinned slightly. She said if we're going to air our dirty laundry, we better make it count for something. The ballroom was almost empty now, their voices echoing in the large space. James looked at the walls where Malik's art had hung, scenes of street life rendered in stark, honest detail. You know, James said carefully, I'm proud of who you are. Not who you might have been if I'd stayed, but who you actually are. Malik absorbed this, then nodded once. Yeah. Me too. He picked up a box of artwork. Come on, old man. We've got work to do. They carried the last boxes out together, father and son walking in step. Through the hotel's glass doors, James could see reporters already gathering, hungry for their story. But for now, in this moment, they were just two men building something new from the wreckage of the past. The attack happened at midnight. Security cameras caught it all, 3 men in hoodies breaking into the nearly completed youth center, methodically smashing windows, spray painting walls, destroying months of work. They saved the art room for last, shredding canvases and breaking every easel Malik had carefully assembled. James arrived first, alerted by security. He stood in the wreckage, glass crunching under his shoes, trying to process the destruction. Then he heard running footsteps. No, no, no. Malik burst through the broken door, Aisha close behind. He stopped dead at the sight of his ruined art room. All the kids' work. The walls were covered with spray-painted slurs, street rats go home. No thugs here. Keep our neighborhood clean. Aisha pulled out her phone, documenting the damage. This isn't random vandalism, she said grimly. This is organized. Someone wants us gone. Police arrived, took statements, made non-committal noises about investigation priorities. James watched Malik move through the space, touching broken things with trembling hands. We can rebuild, James offered. Insurance will cover dash. This isn't about money. Malik's fist hit a damaged wall. They destroyed their art. Their stories. Things that can't be replaced. More people arrived, shelter kids who'd been helping with the center, community members who'd supported the project, even some of Malik's old street friends. They stood in shocked silence, taking in the devastation. We should organize a vigil, Aisha suggested quietly. Show them they can't scare us away. Malik nodded slowly, his initial rage transforming into determination. Tonight. With candles. Right here. James stepped forward. Maybe we should wait, let things cool down dash. No. Malik's voice was firm. They want us to hide. To feel ashamed. We won't. Word spread quickly through social media and street networks. By sunset, hundreds had gathered, holding candles and hand-drawn signs. Malik and Aisha moved through the crowd, organizing people into a protective circle around the building. James hung back, watching his son work. He'd seen Malik's leadership before, but this was different. This was pure conviction, turning tragedy into strength. Then the counter-protesters arrived. A small group at first, then more. They carried their own signs: property values matter. Support police, not criminals. No homeless shelter in our backyard. The tension rose as the groups faced each other across the street. Police appeared, forming a line between them. James moved closer to Malik, instinctively protective. "Stay back," Malik warned. "Your presence just makes them angrier. I'm not leaving you here. This isn't your fight." "Yes, it is." James stepped up beside his son. "It became my fight the day I found you." Social media exploded with images of father and son standing together at the vigil. #StandWithMalik started trending. News vans appeared, their lights harsh in the growing darkness. The counter-protesters grew louder, more aggressive. Someone threw a bottle. It shattered near Aisha, glass mixing with the earlier destruction. "If you're really with us," Malik said suddenly to James, "prove it. Talk to them. They're your kind of people." James looked at the angry faces across the street: middle-class property owners, business people, parents worried about neighborhood change. He'd been one of them, blind to the human cost of their comfort. He walked toward the police line, hands raised. "I want to speak to them." The officers hesitated, then parted. James faced the counter-protesters, recognizing some from charity galas and business meetings. "You're afraid," he began. "I understand that. Change is scary. But look behind me." He gestured to the vigil. "Those aren't criminals or thugs. They're children. Children like my son, who lived on these streets because people like us looked away." The crowd stirred uncomfortably. James continued, his voice carrying in the night air. "You're worried about property values? I'm a developer. I know property. But I also know the cost of ignoring human value. Of treating people like problems instead of possibilities." He saw phones recording, knew his words would be online within minutes. His board would be furious. Investors would panic. He didn't care. That building isn't just a shelter. It's a statement. That every life matters. That every child deserves a chance. Even the ones we've tried so hard not to see. The tension began to shift. Some counter-protesters drifted away, others lowered their signs. Behind him, the vigil continued, candlelight steady in the darkness. When James returned to Malik's side, his son's expression was unreadable. "That'll cost you," Malik said finally. "Some things are worth the cost." They stood together as the night deepened, watching their two worlds collide and begin, perhaps, to understand each other. The damaged building loomed behind them, its broken windows reflecting candlelight like tears. The revelation came during the rebuilding. A familiar figure appeared at the construction site, impeccably dressed and radiating artificial concern. Victor Reeves, James's former business partner, surveyed the damage with practiced sympathy. "Terrible business, this vandalism," he said smoothly. "Perhaps it's a sign to reconsider the project's location." James stiffened, recognizing something in Victor's tone. "You know something about this?" James. Victor smiled thinly. "Always so direct. Let's talk privately." But Malik had already emerged from the building, covered in paint from restoration work. He froze at the sight of Victor, something clicking in his expression. "I know you," Malik said slowly. "You used to come to Mom's diner. Before." Victor's smile faltered slightly. "Ah, young Mr. Thompson. Yes, I did frequent that establishment. Such a shame about its closure." "Closure?" Malik stepped forward. "You mean when the health department suddenly found violations after Mom refused to sell? When our landlord doubled the rent overnight?" James looked between them, pieces falling into place. "Victor, what did you do?" "What I had to." Victor's pretense dropped. "Your father asked me to handle the situation. A CEO's son couldn't be involved with a waitress from the wrong side of town. Especially not with a child on the way." The truth hit James like a physical blow. "You knew about Sarah's pregnancy?" "Of course." Victor straightened his tie. "Your father was quite concerned about potential inheritance complications. I made sure Miss Thompson understood her position. The health inspections, the rent increases, the blocked job applications, all necessary precautions. Malik lunged forward, but James caught his arm. You destroyed our lives, Malik spat. Made us homeless. Made Mom sick from working 3 jobs. I protected the Caldwell family interests. Victor seemed unperturbed. Just as I'm trying to do now. This center of yours, James, it's bad for business. Bad for the neighborhood. Bad for your company's image. The vandalism, James said quietly. That was you. An unfortunate necessity. But perhaps now you'll see reason. Return to more appropriate charitable endeavors. James released Malik's arm, but his son didn't move. They stood together, father and son, facing the men who'd orchestrated their separation. You're fired, James said simply. Victor laughed. You can't fire me. I'm a partner. And I have documents, records of every decision your father made regarding the Thompson situation. Imagine the scandal. Release them, Malik challenged. Show everyone what you did. We're not afraid of the truth anymore. Bold words from a street rat, Victor sneered. But think carefully, James. Your father's legacy dash. My father was wrong, James interrupted. And so were you. Release whatever you want. In fact. He pulled out his phone, still recording. Why don't you repeat everything you just said? About orchestrating our separation. About the vandalism. Victor's composure cracked. You wouldn't dare dash. Watch me. James's finger hovered over the share button. Unless you'd prefer to resign quietly. Sign over your partnership. Leave us alone. The standoff lasted several tense moments. Finally, Victor straightened his jacket. You're making a mistake. No, James replied. I made my mistake 15 years ago, letting people like you decide what was best for my family. After Victor left, Malik turned to his father. You knew about him coming to the diner? No. James ran a hand through his hair. But I should have. Should have questioned why Sarah disappeared so completely. Should have fought harder to find her. Mom said. Malik hesitated. She said someone threatened to have her arrested if she contacted you. Said they had evidence she was extorting your family. Victor. James's voice was heavy with realization. Always Victor, protecting the family interests. They stood in silence, surrounded by the half-repaired damage of Victor's latest attempt to separate them. What now? Malik finally asked. Now we finish rebuilding. Together. James looked at his son. And then we make sure everyone knows the truth. Not just about Victor, about all of it. The system that lets people like him destroy lives in the name of protecting wealth. It'll be messy, Malik warned. Lots of rich people won't like their dirty laundry exposed. Good. James smiled grimly. Maybe it's time they felt uncomfortable. Like your mother said, sometimes that's where change starts. Construction sounds resumed around them as workers returned to their tasks. Father and son surveyed the progress, walls rising again, stronger than before, built on a foundation of hard truths and healing wounds. You know, Malik said thoughtfully, we should add a legal clinic to the center. Help other families fight back when people like Victor try to destroy them. Already working on it, James replied. Your mother suggested the same thing. They shared a look of understanding. The past couldn't be undone, but its lessons could build a better future. Together, they turned back to the work ahead, knowing that every repaired wall and restored painting was an act of defiance against those who tried to keep them apart. The youth center would stand as a testament to resilience, to second chances, to the power of truth over privilege. And somewhere in the city, Victor Reeves was learning a lesson James had already embraced: some things matter more than family legacies and business interests. Some things, like love, justice, and redemption, are worth any cost.